Captain Sarah Chen had heard the whispers her entire career. Diversity hire. Token female. Quota pilot. The words followed her through every airport terminal, every crew briefing, every flight deck she stepped onto. At 34, she had logged over 8,000 flight hours and held certifications that most pilots could only dream of, yet still faced the same tired accusations that questioned whether she truly belonged in the cockpit of a commercial airliner. The morning of October 15th started like any other at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Sarah arrived at 5:30 a.m. for her pre-flight preparations, coffee in hand, reviewing weather reports and flight plans for what should have been a routine day of regional flights. She was scheduled to pilot 6 short-haul routes across the Midwest, flying a twin-engine turboprop that seated 48 passengers. It was unglamorous work compared to the international routes flown by the senior captains. But Sarah approached every flight with the same meticulous attention to detail that had earned her spotless safety record. Her first officer that day was Marcus Williams, a 26-year-old pilot with barely 1,200 hours of experience. Marcus had been vocal about his skepticism regarding political correctness in hiring practices, though he was careful to couch his opinions in seemingly neutral language about merit and qualifications. During their pre-flight briefing, his tone was polite but distant. His responses clipped and professional in a way that suggested he was merely tolerating her presence as captain. The first 3 flights proceeded without incident. Sarah navigated morning fog banks over Iowa, handled crosswinds during a landing in Des Moines, and managed an elderly passenger's medical emergency with calm efficiency. Each time, she noticed Marcus watching her closely, as if waiting for her to make a mistake that would validate his preconceptions. The cabin crew, too, seemed more relaxed with previous male captains they had flown with, though they treated Sarah with grudging respect. By afternoon, an unusual weather pattern was developing across the region. The meteorology reports showed a massive storm system moving in from the west, but the timing and intensity forecasts kept changing. What had been predicted as scattered thunderstorms was rapidly evolving into something more severe. Sarah studied the radar images with growing concern, noting the peculiar way the storm cells were organizing and the dramatic pressure drops being recorded at weather stations in their flight path. As they prepared for their 4th flight of the day, bound for Minneapolis, Sarah made the decision to take on extra fuel despite the weight penalty it would impose. Marcus questioned the choice, pointing out that it would reduce their passenger capacity and delay their departure. Sarah explained her reasoning about the deteriorating weather conditions, but she could see in his expression that he viewed her caution as typical female overcautiousness rather than sound judgment. The flight to Minneapolis became increasingly turbulent as they approached the leading edge of the storm system. Sarah requested multiple course deviations from air traffic control to avoid the worst of the weather cells, each time having to justify her decisions to controllers who seemed eager to keep traffic flowing despite the conditions. The passengers grew nervous as the aircraft bucked and rolled through increasingly violent air. But Sarah maintained steady communication with the cabin, her voice calm and reassuring over the intercom. It was during the approach to Minneapolis that the first real sign of trouble emerged. The airport's instrument landing system began showing intermittent failures, a common occurrence during electrical storms, but one that required pilots to be prepared for manual approaches. Sarah ran through the backup procedures with Marcus, ensuring he understood the approach minimums and missed approach procedures. She noticed his hands were slightly shaky as he checked the instruments, the first crack in his confident demeanor. They managed to land safely in Minneapolis despite the challenging conditions, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The storm system had intensified beyond all forecasts, with multiple tornado warnings being issued across the region. Airport operations were becoming increasingly chaotic as flights were delayed or canceled, and passengers were growing frustrated with the mounting delays. During their brief layover, Sarah received word that their return flights were still scheduled to operate despite the worsening weather. The airline's operations center was under pressure to maintain schedule integrity, and there was reluctance to cancel flights unless absolutely necessary. Sarah spent extra time studying the updated weather reports, noting that the storm system was not only more intense than predicted but was also moving faster than expected. As they prepared for their 5th flight of the day, heading back toward Chicago, the airport meteorologist pulled Sarah aside. "Captain, he said quietly. "I've been watching weather for 23 years, and I've never seen a system quite like this one. The electrical activity is off the charts, and we're getting reports of microbursts and wind shear that are exceeding our measurement capabilities. If I were you, I'd seriously consider staying put until this thing passes." Sarah appreciated the informal warning, but she also knew that the decision to ground flights was not hers alone to make. The airline's dispatch office had cleared the flight, and passengers were already boarding. She made the decision to proceed but briefed Marcus extensively on the emergency procedures they might need if conditions continued to deteriorate. She also spoke personally with the lead flight attendant, explaining that they might encounter severe turbulence and should prepare the cabin accordingly. The takeoff from Minneapolis was rough, with significant crosswinds that tested Sarah's skills as they climbed through multiple layers of turbulence. As they reached their cruising altitude, the weather radar showed an increasingly ominous picture. The storm system had organized into a massive supercell complex spanning nearly 300 miles, with embedded thunderstorms showing precipitation rates and wind velocities that were well beyond normal parameters. Air traffic control began rerouting flights around the worst of the weather, but the safe corridors were becoming increasingly narrow. Sarah found herself constantly requesting course changes, sometimes every few minutes, as new cells developed and existing ones intensified. The workload in the cockpit increased dramatically as they tried to navigate through the maze of severe weather while maintaining safe separation from other aircraft that were all attempting similar deviations. It was about halfway through the flight that the first aircraft ahead of them declared an emergency. A larger commercial jet reported complete electrical failure after what the pilot described as the most intense lightning strike I've ever experienced. The aircraft was still flyable, but without navigation equipment or radio communications. The crew was forced to navigate using backup instruments, while air traffic control tried to vector them toward the nearest suitable airport. Sarah listened to the radio chatter with growing apprehension. If a larger aircraft with more sophisticated electrical systems could suffer such a catastrophic failure, her smaller regional aircraft would be even more vulnerable. She began preparing for the possibility that they too might lose electrical power. Reviewing the emergency procedures for flying without instruments and discussing contingency plans with Marcus, the storm seemed to be developing its own malevolent intelligence, spawning new cells faster than the weather radar could track them. Sarah noticed that the normal patterns of storm movement were being disrupted by the interaction between multiple weather fronts, creating conditions that were not covered in any of her training scenarios. The turbulence increased to the point where even experienced passengers were becoming visibly frightened, and the flight attendants were struggling to maintain their composure while ensuring everyone remained safely secured in their seats. As they approached the Chicago area, the situation took a dramatic turn for the worse. The storm system had intensified to the point where multiple airports across the region were reporting zero visibility conditions, with rain falling so heavily that runway drainage systems were being overwhelmed. O'Hare International had closed 3 of its 4 runways due to standing water, and the remaining runway was operating under severely restricted conditions. Sarah requested permission to divert to their alternate airport, but air traffic control informed her that conditions there were even worse. In fact, nearly every airport within their fuel range was reporting conditions that were either at or below landing minimums. The storm had developed into what meteorologists would later describe as a once-in-a-century weather event, with multiple destructive elements combining to create unprecedented hazardous flying conditions. It was then that Marcus, his voice tight with stress, asked the question that Sarah had been dreading. "Captain, what happens if we can't find anywhere to land?" Sarah looked at their fuel gauges and did some quick calculations. They had perhaps 90 minutes of fuel remaining, maybe 2 hours if she leaned the engines to their most efficient settings. But with every airport in the region reporting deteriorating conditions, those numbers were becoming increasingly academic. The weight of command had never felt heavier, as Sarah realized they were facing a situation that no amount of training had fully prepared them for. Behind her, 46 passengers trusted her to bring them home safely, while ahead lay a wall of weather that seemed determined to prevent exactly that outcome. The whispers about being a quota pilot seemed almost absurd now, faced with conditions that would challenge even the most experienced aviators. As Sarah keyed her microphone to request yet another vector around a newly forming storm cell, she had no way of knowing that this was only the beginning of what would become the most challenging night of her aviation career. The storm was about to test not only her flying skills but also her ability to make life and death decisions under pressure that few pilots would ever face. The real test of whether she belonged in that captain's seat was just beginning. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate transmissions as aircraft throughout the region found themselves trapped in the same nightmarish situation. Sarah listened to pilot after pilot requesting emergency diversions, only to be told that their alternate airports were also socked in with zero visibility conditions. The storm system had expanded beyond all meteorological predictions, creating what amounted to a wall of impenetrable weather across the entire Great Lakes region. Flight 447. "This is Chicago approach," came the voice of an air traffic controller, who was clearly struggling to manage an unprecedented crisis. "Be advised that O'Hare is now reporting visibility 0 to 0 in heavy rain and fog. Winds are gusting to 67 knots with severe wind shear reported on all approaches. We're suspending all landing operations until further notice." Sarah felt Marcus tense beside her as the implications sank in. Their destination airport was closed, their alternate was closed, and they were burning through their fuel reserves while circling in increasingly violent weather. She began working through their options, but each possibility seemed to lead to the same dead end. Every airport within reasonable flying distance was reporting conditions that made landing either impossible or extremely dangerous. "Captain," Marcus said, his voice betraying the first real signs of panic, "maybe we should declare an emergency and try to get priority handling into O'Hare anyway. I mean, if we're going to run out of fuel." His words trailed off as he realized the futility of what he was suggesting. Priority handling meant nothing if the runway was invisible and the winds were too strong for a safe landing. Sarah's mind raced through her training, searching for solutions that might not exist. She had studied every emergency scenario in the books, but this situation was rapidly moving beyond the boundaries of conventional problem-solving. The storm had essentially created a no-fly zone, covering hundreds of square miles, trapping numerous aircraft in a deadly game of aerial musical chairs with no available landing spots. It was then that she remembered something from her early training days, a conversation with an old instructor who had flown cargo planes in Alaska. He had told her about landing at remote airstrips in complete whiteout conditions, using nothing but radio beacons and dead reckoning navigation. "Sometimes," he had said, "you have to land where the books say you can't land, because the alternative is not landing at all." Sarah pulled out her approach plates and began studying airports that she had never seriously considered as options. Small municipal fields, private corporate strips, even abandoned military bases that might still have usable runways. Most lacked the sophisticated instrument approach systems that modern commercial aviation relied upon, but they also might be far enough from the storm center to offer marginally better conditions. "Marcus," she said, keying her microphone to contact air traffic control, "I need you to start looking at every airport within 150 miles. Don't worry about whether we're certified to land there or whether they can handle commercial traffic. Right now, I'm more concerned with finding a piece of concrete long enough to stop this airplane." The air traffic controller seemed surprised by her request for information about smaller airports. "Flight 447. Are you declaring an emergency?" he asked. Sarah hesitated for a moment, knowing that declaring an emergency would bring additional resources to bear but would also trigger a cascade of regulatory and administrative consequences. "Not yet," she replied, "but I need options. The weather has eliminated all of our primary and alternate airports, and I'm exploring creative solutions." She could hear other pilots on the frequency expressing similar concerns, and realized that her situation was far from unique. The storm had created what aviation experts would later term a black swan event, a scenario so unlikely and severe that it fell outside the realm of normal contingency planning. As Sarah studied the charts, she noticed a small airport about 80 miles to the northeast that was just outside the storm's current boundaries. Millfield Regional was a former military training base that had been converted to civilian use, with a single runway that was long enough to handle her aircraft but lacked any modern navigation aids. More importantly, the latest weather report showed marginal VFR conditions, not good, but potentially flyable. Chicago approach, Flight 447. Sarah transmitted, requesting vectors to Millfield Regional. I show current weather there as 3 miles, visibility and light rain. Winds 270 at 15, gusting to 25. The silence that followed her request was longer than usual, and she could almost hear the controller checking his references to confirm that such an airport actually existed. Flight 447, Millfield Regional is an uncontrolled field with no instrument approaches, the controller finally replied. They don't have approach lighting, precision radar, or emergency equipment. Are you sure you want to attempt an approach there? The question was loaded with implications about liability and safety standards, but Sarah was beginning to realize that conventional safety standards might not apply to their current situation. Before she could respond, another voice broke in on the frequency. Chicago approach. This is American 1000. 205. We're declaring a fuel emergency and requesting immediate vectors to any airport with viable landing conditions. We have 15 minutes of fuel remaining and 43 passengers on board. The desperation in the pilot's voice was unmistakable, and Sarah realized that she was not alone in facing impossible choices. The next hour became a blur of increasingly frantic radio communications, as multiple aircraft found themselves in similar predicaments. Sarah listened to pilot after pilot declaring emergencies, requesting priority approaches to airports that couldn't accommodate them, and making increasingly desperate attempts to find safe haven. The storm had created a crisis that was overwhelming the air traffic control system's ability to respond. It was during this chaos that Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her career. Instead of joining the queue of aircraft, declaring emergencies, and hoping for miraculous improvements in weather conditions, she chose to take control of her own destiny. She informed air traffic control that she was proceeding to Millfield Regional under visual flight rules, essentially accepting full responsibility for the safety of her aircraft and passengers. Flight 447, Roger, the controller acknowledged, his voice betraying relief that at least one aircraft was removing itself from his increasingly unmanageable situation. Contact Millfield traffic on frequency 122.8. Good luck. The simple phrase, good luck, spoke volumes about the controller's assessment of her chances. But Sarah was committed to her course of action. As they turned toward Millfield, Sarah began preparing for an approach unlike anything she had attempted in commercial aviation. Without instrument landing systems or approach lighting, she would need to rely on visual references and basic navigation techniques that harked back to aviation's earliest days. She briefed Marcus on the approach procedure, noting his obvious anxiety about attempting a landing at an unfamiliar airport in deteriorating weather conditions. Captain, Marcus said, his voice tight with stress, shouldn't we try to hold somewhere until the weather improves? I mean, this is pretty far outside normal procedures. Sarah understood his concern, but she also knew that holding was only viable if you had sufficient fuel, and their reserves were dwindling rapidly. More importantly, the weather forecasts showed no signs of improvement for at least 6 hours. Marcus, I need you to trust me on this, Sarah replied, checking their fuel gauges again. We have one shot at this approach, and I need your complete focus and cooperation. Can you do that? She watched as he struggled with his doubts, weighing his skepticism about her abilities against the reality of their situation. Finally, he nodded, though his reluctance was obvious. As they approached Millfield Regional, Sarah could see that the weather was indeed marginal. The visibility was sufficient for a visual approach, but rain was falling steadily, and the cloud ceiling was lower than she would have preferred. More concerning was the crosswind component, which was near the limits of their aircraft's capabilities. She would need to execute a perfect approach, with very little margin for error. The airport itself was a stark reminder of aviation's more primitive past. The single runway was adequate in length but lacked the precision approach path indicators and sophisticated lighting systems that modern pilots relied upon. There was no control tower, no emergency equipment standing by, and no ground support personnel visible anywhere on the field. Sarah was truly on her own. As she lined up for the approach, Sarah became acutely aware of the 46 passengers behind her who had entrusted their lives to her judgment. She thought about the whispers and doubts that had followed her throughout her career, and realized that this moment would either validate or destroy every assumption people had made about her capabilities. There would be no hiding behind regulations or blaming equipment failures. This landing would be a pure test of piloting skill. The approach required constant corrections for wind drift and turbulence, with Sarah making minute adjustments to power and attitude as she fought to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway centerline. Marcus called out airspeed and altitude readings, his voice betraying increasing tension as they descended through the rain and turbulence toward the unforgiving concrete below. At 200 feet above the ground, Sarah caught her first clear glimpse of the runway through the rain and mist. It looked impossibly narrow and short compared to the wide, well-lit runways she was accustomed to using. But it was real, it was solid, and it represented salvation for everyone on board her aircraft. She committed fully to the landing, knowing that there was no room for hesitation or second-guessing. The touchdown was firm but controlled, with Sarah immediately applying maximum braking and reverse thrust to stop the aircraft on the relatively short runway. As they rolled to a stop, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. But she knew that their ordeal was far from over. They were safe on the ground, but they were also stranded at a remote airport with limited facilities and no clear plan for getting their passengers to their final destinations. As Sarah shut down the engines and began the post-flight procedures, she noticed that Marcus was staring at her with an expression she had never seen before. It wasn't the grudging respect or barely concealed skepticism she had grown accustomed to, but something approaching genuine admiration. For the first time since they had been paired together, he seemed to be seeing her as a pilot rather than as a symbol of whatever social trends he disagreed with. But their relief was short-lived. As Sarah checked in with company operations to report their safe arrival, she learned that their situation was far from unique. Multiple aircraft from their airline were scattered across remote airports throughout the region, and the storm showed no signs of abating. More importantly, she discovered that several flights were still airborne, running critically low on fuel and unable to find safe places to land. The operations controller's voice was strained as he explained the magnitude of the crisis. "Captain Chen, we have at least 12 aircraft still in the air with less than 30 minutes of fuel remaining. Every major airport in the region is closed due to weather, and we're running out of options. Some of these flights are carrying over 200 passengers each." The implications were staggering. Potentially thousands of lives at risk. With few viable solutions available, Sarah looked out at the rain-soaked runway where her aircraft sat safely, and realized that her own successful landing was only the beginning of the night's challenges. The storm had created an unprecedented aviation emergency, and she was about to discover that her skills as a pilot were needed now more than ever. The real test of her abilities was just beginning, and the stakes were about to become much higher than the safety of her own passengers. Sarah stared at the radio in disbelief as the full scope of the crisis became clear. 12 aircraft, still airborne, fuel running critically low, and nowhere safe to land. The storm had created an impossible situation that was rapidly evolving from a regional weather emergency into a potential aviation disaster of unprecedented proportions. She could hear the desperation in the operations controller's voice as he outlined the grim mathematics of the situation. "Captain Chen," the controller continued, "we need every pilot with local area knowledge to help guide these aircraft to safety. You're one of the few who managed to find a viable landing site. When daughters allow, and we're hoping you can assist with vectoring other flights to similar airports." The request was highly irregular. Commercial pilots didn't typically serve as impromptu air traffic controllers. But nothing about this night was following normal procedures. Sarah looked around the dimly lit airport terminal where her passengers were gathering, confused and worried about their situation but grateful to be safely on the ground. Through the rain-streaked windows, she could see the fuel truck that had been summoned to service their aircraft, along with the single maintenance technician who represented the entire ground support staff at the remote field. It wasn't much, but it was infinitely better than being trapped at altitude with nowhere to land. "Operations, Flight 447, Sarah responded, her mind already working through the possibilities. "I'll do whatever I can to help. What's the fuel status on the most critical aircraft?" The answer came back immediately. Flight 892, a Boeing 737 with 156 passengers, had less than 20 minutes of fuel remaining and was currently circling south of Chicago with no viable landing options. Marcus, who had been listening to the radio traffic with growing concern, turned to Sarah with a puzzled expression. "Captain, what exactly can we do from here? We don't have radar. We don't have direct communication with those aircraft, and we're basically stuck at this tiny airport ourselves." His question highlighted the limitations of their situation. But Sarah was already formulating a plan that went far beyond conventional thinking. "Marcus, I need you to contact every small airport within a 100-mile radius," Sarah said, pulling out sectional charts and spreading them across the terminal's information desk. "Find out current weather conditions, runway lengths, available fuel, and any other relevant information. I'm going to try to create a network of emergency landing sites that can handle these aircraft." The concept was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of waiting for major airports to reopen or for the weather to improve, Sarah proposed using dozens of smaller airports as emergency havens. Many of these fields lacked sophisticated navigation equipment, but they also might be far enough from the storm's center to offer marginal flying conditions. It would require precise coordination and exceptional piloting skills. But it represented the only realistic hope for the aircraft still trapped in the deteriorating weather. Working with the operations center in Chicago, Sarah began plotting potential landing sites on her sectional charts, cross-referencing weather reports with runway capabilities and fuel availability. The picture that emerged was challenging but not hopeless. There were at least 15 small airports that might be able to accommodate emergency landings, scattered across a wide area but potentially accessible to aircraft with sufficient fuel reserves. The first test of her improvised emergency network came with Flight 892, the Boeing 737 that was down to its final minutes of fuel. The aircraft was too large for most small airports, but Sarah identified a former military field about 60 miles northwest of Chicago that had a runway long enough to handle the approach. The challenge would be guiding the aircraft there without the benefit of instrument approaches or approach lighting. "Chicago Center, Flight 447, Sarah transmitted, using her own aircraft's call sign to establish credibility with the air traffic control system. "I have a potential emergency landing site for Flight 892, Grayson Municipal Airport, runway 18 to 36, 7,000 feet long, currently reporting 4 miles visibility and light rain." She provided the airport's coordinates and radio frequency, along with her assessment of the approach challenges the crew would face. The response was immediate and grateful. Within minutes, Flight 892 was being vectored toward Grayson Municipal, with Sarah providing advisory guidance based on her own recent experience landing at an unfamiliar airport in marginal weather conditions. She talked the crew through the visual approach procedures, sharing insights about wind patterns and visibility constraints that could only come from someone who had just faced similar challenges. As Flight 892 began its approach to Grayson Municipal, Sarah coordinated the placement of additional aircraft at other small airports throughout the region. Each landing required careful assessment of aircraft capabilities versus airport limitations, with safety margins that were often uncomfortably thin. She found herself serving as an unofficial air traffic coordinator, matching aircraft with airports based on fuel remaining, passenger load, and crew experience levels. The radio traffic became increasingly intense as multiple aircraft declared fuel emergencies and requested immediate vectors to any available landing sites. Sarah worked frantically to coordinate the emergency network, communicating with airport operators who had never handled commercial aircraft and pilots who had never attempted landings at unfamiliar airports in severe weather conditions. Flight 892's approach to Grayson Municipal became a nail-biting drama that played out over the radio frequencies. The crew reported moderate turbulence and wind shear during the descent, with visibility dropping to minimums just as they reached decision altitude. For several agonizing moments, there was radio silence as the aircraft disappeared into the rain and low clouds surrounding the airport. "Grayson traffic, American 892 is safely on the ground," came the pilot's voice, hoarse with exhaustion but unmistakably relieved. The simple transmission triggered cheers in the Chicago Operations Center and marked the first successful emergency landing in Sarah's improvised network. But there were still 11 aircraft aloft, and several were approaching critical fuel states. Over the next 3 hours, Sarah orchestrated what would later be described as one of the most complex emergency aviation operations in commercial history. Working with minimal resources and improvised procedures, she guided aircraft to landing sites that ranged from abandoned military bases to private corporate fields. Each landing required unique solutions and exceptional piloting skills. But one by one, the aircraft found safe haven. The operation wasn't without its close calls. Flight 1247, carrying 42 passengers, suffered a blown tire during landing at a short rural airport and skidded off the runway into soft ground. No one was seriously injured, but the incident highlighted the risks inherent in using marginal facilities for emergency operations. Another flight had to attempt 3 different airports before finding conditions suitable for a safe landing, burning through their final fuel reserves in the process. Marcus, who had initially questioned Sarah's unconventional approach, became her most valuable assistant as the night progressed. He coordinated with ground crews at remote airports, arranged for passenger accommodations, and helped manage the complex logistics of scattering aircraft across dozens of small airfields. His earlier skepticism about her abilities had been completely replaced by obvious respect and admiration. As dawn broke over the Midwest, the storm finally began to weaken, and major airports started reopening. Sarah conducted a final radio check with all the aircraft in her emergency network, confirming that passengers and crews were safe and making arrangements for recovery operations. The unofficial tally was staggering. 90 aircraft had been safely landed at 43 different airports, with no fatalities and only minor injuries, despite conditions that had challenged even the most experienced pilots. The aftermath of that night brought changes that rippled throughout the aviation industry. Sarah found herself testifying before congressional committees about emergency preparedness and crisis management, sharing insights that led to new protocols for handling widespread weather emergencies. Her improvised coordination network became the basis for formal emergency response procedures that were adopted by airlines and air traffic control facilities nationwide. More personally significant were the changes in how her colleagues viewed her capabilities. The whispers about being a quota pilot disappeared entirely, replaced by recognition as one of the most skilled and resourceful pilots in commercial aviation. Marcus, in particular, became one of her strongest advocates, openly acknowledging how wrong his initial assumptions had been and crediting her leadership with saving hundreds of lives. The media attention that followed the emergency operation was overwhelming, with Sarah reluctantly accepting interviews and speaking engagements that celebrated her role in the crisis response. She consistently emphasized the team effort involved and the contributions of other pilots, controllers, and ground personnel who had worked through the night to ensure everyone's safety. But there was no denying that her quick thinking and unconventional solutions had been the catalyst for the successful operation. Within 6 months, Sarah was promoted to chief pilot for her airline's regional operations, with responsibilities that included emergency response planning and crew training. She used her new position to develop training programs that emphasized creative problem-solving and decision-making under pressure, ensuring that future pilots would be better prepared for situations that fell outside normal operational parameters. The small airport where Sarah had first landed that night eventually installed modern navigation equipment and expanded its facilities, partly in recognition of its role in the emergency operation. A plaque in the terminal commemorated the night when aviation professionals proved that skill, determination, and innovative thinking could overcome even the most challenging circumstances. Years later, when asked about the factors that enabled her to successfully coordinate such a complex emergency operation, Sarah would always return to the same theme: the importance of viewing challenges as opportunities rather than obstacles. The storm that had trapped dozens of aircraft had also revealed the potential for solutions that existed outside conventional thinking, requiring only the courage to pursue them. The night that had begun with whispered doubts about a quota pilot ended with universal recognition of exceptional airmanship and leadership under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Sarah had not only proven her own capabilities but had also demonstrated the kind of innovative thinking that would define the next generation of aviation safety protocols. The storm had tested everyone involved, but it had also revealed reserves of skill and determination that might never have been discovered under normal circumstances. The transformation in industry attitudes was perhaps the most significant long-term outcome of that night's events. The focus shifted from demographic characteristics of pilots to demonstrable skills and decision-making abilities, with Sarah's performance serving as a powerful example of what truly mattered in aviation: the ability to safely transport passengers regardless of the challenges encountered. The quota system debates that had once dominated industry discussions were replaced by recognition that excellent pilots come from all backgrounds, and that diversity itself could be a source of innovative solutions to complex problems. In the end, the storm had done more than test the limits of aviation weather tolerance. It had challenged fundamental assumptions about leadership, capability, and the value of different perspectives in solving critical problems. Sarah Chen had entered that night as a pilot whose qualifications were questioned. She emerged as a leader whose innovations would influence aviation safety for generations to come.